much, Jan, for welcoming us to Mainz. I will not bore you with a long introduction. I will bore you with a long introduction tomorrow morning. So all I want to say is that we're extremely happy that Kingsley Baird has joined us and has agreed to deliver the keynote lecture. Few artists alive today have engaged with military themes and military institutions as consistently and as thoughtfully as Kingsley. He is based in New Zealand at Massey University, but he has worked in New Zealand, Australia, Germany, France, Belgium, and various other countries that perhaps you will mention in your own presentation. He's known among many, many other works for the New Zealand Memorial in the Australian capital, Canberra, and of course for New Zealand's Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. He has also been an artist in residence at Ypres, which is represented here by Patron. And I'm really looking forward to the keynote lecture. Thank you.
Guten Abend, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to present at the conference. I would like to thank Misha and Jan for the invitation to speak today, and also to express my thanks to the Georg Foster Forum. Misha and I were trying to work out if there's a connection between New Zealand and Georg Foster, because there was a naturalist called Georg Foster who sailed with James Cook on his second voyage, and they spent a lot of time sailing around New Zealand. I'd also like to thank Ainura, Natalia, and also Christina for the organisation that is behind this event. So in the coming days, I look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be a fascinating collection of papers. I've got a long-standing interest in multi-trans and interdisciplinary research, and the material at this conference offers a great deal in that regard. In this lecture, I'll briefly describe the evolution of my creative practice towards engagements with military institutions and discuss intersections between creativity and the military, including what it might mean for an artist to be embedded in a military institution, and finally unfold my own distinctive experience as a creative practitioner working in partnership with Dresden's Military History Museum. Firstly, some context in relation to my creative practice. So I'm a visual artist working mainly in the field of sculpture. My work explores memory, memorialization, and remembrance, primarily in relation to war, culture, national identity, history, mythology, and place, and also creating new conceptual, aesthetic, and material memory forms. I describe myself primarily as a memory artist. The paper will discuss personal experiences and motivations as an artist working in close proximity to military culture. This creative practice military relationship is expressed in a variety of contexts, including designing war memorials, exhibiting in military museums, and actively participating in military commemorative rituals. The potential risks being co-opted by military agendas and benefits having a platform to use my creative voice to express the consequences of martial violence from my perspective will be addressed. So I'll begin this presentation by introducing something of my background and artwork as it pertains to the evolution of my relationship with military institutions. My association as an artist with the military perhaps has its roots in my childhood and the long shadows of the First and Second World Wars and the influence of these conflicts on literature and popular culture, such as films and comics. In addition, I played childhood war games, have familial connections to the war, and there are the ubiquitous collective remembrance events in New Zealand's commemorative calendar. So that's the familial connection. That's my maternal grandfather, Albert George Grant, who fought in the New Zealand Army in the First World War. I am, as philosopher A.C. Grayling describes himself, the closest thing to a pacifist that one can be without being a pacifist, agreeing with Grayling's contention that war is sometimes the last resort in the face of what would be a greater evil than the evil of war itself. My long-term creative engagement with the subject of war is firstly driven by an attempt to understand why human beings perpetrate such terrible violence against their fellows. Secondly, I'm motivated by empathy for the victims of war, the dead and the visibly and invisibly wounded. And thirdly, as a memory artist, I have an obligation to remember the tragedy of war and hope that my memorial forms can, in some small way, remind of its price. I believe that through their creative acts, artists can, however modestly, play the role of activists working towards a state of peace. Unlike the first-hand war experience of official war artists, mine is vicarious. I've neither been a witness to war nor a combatant. Making artwork in relation to war is generally explored in the security of my suburban studio in Wellington, far from any front line. About 25 years ago, it was the concurrence of designing two memorials, one a national monument and the other a memorial sculpture to my older brother, who had died in a motorcycle accident during my teenage years, that I began to understand the relationship between personal trauma and that of a nation. I became aware that sites of remembrance, such as memorials, could play a role in assuaging individual and community loss. Since that time, my practice has intersected with military institutions or events. Firstly, as the designer of national memorials, such as the New Zealand Memorial in Canberra, dedicated in 2001, and secondly, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Wellington in 2004. Both are key focal points of military commemorative rituals, and it is on these occasions when the military's presence in democracies during peacetime can be tolerably highly visible, reminding the public of the military's role in the state and the price paid for national security. While the military is a specific form of institutional culture, I don't see military identity as a singular concept, or the military as a monolithic or homogeneous body. While core beliefs, assumptions, and values of military organizations might be shared, the membership of military institutions is drawn from a diverse community. Although my relationships with those in military institutions has been primarily with curators and military historians, when working in museums, I've engaged with a wide range of museum staff, including serving military personnel. Artists, too, while characterized by certain behaviors, attitudes, technical proficiency, and generally have the quality of creativity attributed to them by wider society, also reflect great diversity. At an intrinsic level, writes Alice Cree, creativity and military do not seem to be words that fit together comfortably. To be creative, according to Victoria Basham and Sarah Bulmer, is to prioritize imagination, expression, freedom, messiness, failure, and intuition, whereas military power and militarization are wrapped up in discipline, violence, and control. However, since ancient times, writes artist Christophe Wodesco, artists have been major contributors to the culture of war. The massive presence in museums of military art and the participation of artists in war propaganda efforts and designing symbolically and visually effective uniforms, armor, and camouflage, as well as hundreds of thousands of artistically conceived war memorials, monuments, and shrines that promote war as a way to make peace, or as a way of admiring killing and death as a noble duty and a sacred sacrifice. Perhaps the most important contribution artists can make to the culture of war, and what motivates my art practice concerned with conflict, is to endeavour to convince our fellow human beings of what Richard Neuhauser and John Jeffreys Martin describes as the need to imagine a warless world. The verb embed is first recorded in English in 1778 as a geological term and meant to lay in a bed of surrounding matter, originally in reference to fossils in rock. In contemporary use, we're perhaps most familiar with the term embedded as applied to the 2003 Iraq War to describe the practice of attaching war correspondents to military units for the purpose of covering conflict. Regarding the perceived threat to independent reporting when journalists are embedded, Robert D. Kaplan observed that, quote, people in media circles have been debating whether journalists lose their professional detachment under such circumstances and begin to identify too closely with the troops they are covering. In addition, the practice has been criticised as being part of a propaganda campaign, whereby embedded journalists accompanying the invading forces are seen as cheerleaders and media relations representatives. That situation aligns with another expression, to be in bed with, referring to being in an undesirably close association, working with a person or organization, or to be involved with them in some way that causes other people not to trust you. During the First World War, the long-standing association between art and the military saw this relationship formalized as artists operated within governments and military bodies as official war artists. Being open to encounters with military power, personnel, practices, and institutions is not without its dangers, cautioned Victoria Basham and Sarah Bullner. Creativity has always been wrapped up with the practice of war making, including in insidious ways, contends Alice Cree. As Audrey Reeves and Charlotte Heath Kelly observed, museums, memorials, and exhibitions, all spaces in which I am active, enable and shape the reproductions of military capacities. I'm aware there is a danger of intentional or subconscious creative self-censoring when working as an artist in relation to military institutions. There is a risk of being turned, recruited as an asset. After all, for an artist, the military's siren song has a seductive side. There may be opportunities to show work in prestigious and much visited institutions, thus exposing the artist's work to a significant audience. The provision of funding to realize one's exhibition ambitions on a large and otherwise unachievable scale. Opportunities to disseminate one's ideas through a publication funded by the institution. Promotion via its publicity operations, or as an outcome of the institution's stature, the increased likelihood of external reviews of the exhibition. In addition, a museum residency might offer time and space to reflect on ideas deeply and manifest them in an optimum manner. Along with the residency might come free accommodation, travel costs, a budget, in-house technicians or facilities to assist in the production of work, and a stipend. For an academic whose creative practice is recognized as research, the above conditions potentially contribute to the impact they and their institution seek. Another definition of embed is to attach someone to a group, such as a military unit or a government agency, for the purpose of advising or training its members. This definition might apply to a recent experience I had with the military. Last year, I was approached by the New Zealand Defence Force's Heritage Commemorations and Protocol Group, who wanted to use 3 of my bronze sculptures from my project, the Odyssey collection, at the 109th anniversary of the invasion of Gelibolu or Gallipoli Peninsula in the Dardanelles in 1915 during the First World War. I was completely open to the Defence Force about the meanings behind these works, including those that are potentially contentious. Uncontroversially, however, each of the bronze headgear, a New Zealand lemon squeezer, an Australian slouch hat, and a Turkish kabalat, can be seen as metaphorical homelands of 3 protagonists in that campaign. Turkey, whose land was being attacked, and 2 of the invading nations, dominions of the British Empire, Australia and New Zealand. I was picked up at a luxury hotel overlooking the Bosphorus and driven as a sole passenger on the 3 to 4 hour journey to Chanakkale, to another luxury hotel. Every morning, like military clockwork, I was collected by a bus and in the darkness ferried across the narrow Dardanelles Strait to Gallipoli or Gelibolu Peninsula, site of the failed Allied invasion in 1915. On the first day, our party visited significant sites of the action of New Zealand troops during the 1915-16 campaign. My companions included the Chief of Navy and a New Zealand military historian who was present to provide expertise on the New Zealand troop movements and actions in the vicinity. As a civilian, the military historian was also an embedded guest of the Defence Force. On the final day, we attended the Anzac Day dawn service at Anzac Cove, which you can see in the top in the distance there by the sea, where New Zealand and Australian troops landed on the 25th of April, 1915. Anzac Cove is considered hallowed ground for both countries. In the pre-dawn darkness before the official service began, an audio-visual display titled Spirit of Place was shown on a large screen. The AV focused on my 3 sculptures from the Odyssey collection. Later that day, after attending British, French, Australian, and Turkish ceremonies on the peninsula, each reflecting a military presence in different ways, we drove to the top of the peninsula where New Zealand troops had briefly held the ridgeline before their replacements were driven back by Turkish defenders. There, at the service of Chanakkale, a significant site of New Zealand heroism, sacrifice, and mythology, at the invitation of the Defence Force, I spoke to the assembled audience about my commemorative art practice. The following morning, I departed Chanakkale to Istanbul Airport, accompanied by a busload of Defence Force staff, including the Defence Force concert party, who the previous day at Chanakkale had sung Waiata, or Maori song, and performed a rousing haka that brought tears to my eyes. Displaying my artwork within military or war museums or as part of commemorative events is a deliberate tactic. My intention is to highlight loss and sacrifice as outcomes of war, and by implication, the responsibility of the military and the wider society of which it is a part for those consequences. My multifaceted experience of exhibiting at Dresden's Military History Museum offers an opportunity for deep reflection regarding the nature of an artist embedded in a military institution. defining what it means to be embedded in relation to the exhibition at the Military History Museum is not simply about a straightforward relationship between an artist and a military institution, which I would say the last experience in Turkey was. While these protagonists, that is the artist and the military institution, are integral to the engagement, I will also discuss factors that influenced my approach and experience, including those which might not have obviously been manifest in the artwork. Nonetheless, these factors affected my experience and the manner in which this artist engaged with this military institution. In 2014, following an invitation from the German Armed Forces Military History Museum in Dresden, I built Stela, a temporary installation in the museum for the 14 Menschen Krieg, the museum's centenary exhibition to mark the beginning of the First World War. Stela was a memorial comprising a stainless steel cenotaph and 18,000 biscuits made from an Anzac biscuit recipe. On the 12th of July, almost 100 years after the start of the First World War, Stela was formally presented for public viewing. In reference to the Eucharist, Cronus devouring his sons, and other influences, the biscuits, whose cookie cutter silhouettes represented soldiers on both sides in the First World War, were offered to museum visitors for consumption. Literal consumption of the biscuits and metaphorical consumption of those we send to war. I imagined that the symbolism of civilians consuming their military, among others, to be a challenging prospect for the Bundeswehr. It was for me. However, if it was a concern, the matter was never raised. For the previous 10 days in the heart of the museum, the sculpture evolved as I stacked the biscuits around the cenotaph form until it disappeared from view. In 2012, I had approached the New Zealand Embassy in Berlin with a request to recommend museums in Germany that might make suitable venues in which to exhibit my temporary installation, Stela. Timing was important because the impending anniversary of the centenary of the First World War was the focus of my work in war and military museums since exhibiting at the Flanders Fields Museum in 2007, and soon to exhibit in 2013 at the Historiale de la Grande Guerre in Patron in France. Naturally, this anniversary was a primary focus of military and other museums. The coincidence with the central theme of my practice and Dresden's Military History Museum's plan to mark the centenary of the beginning of the First World War undoubtedly played a part in the museum's interest in my proposal. The importance of anniversaries for supporting research and public interest cannot be underestimated. Of the two museums recommended by the embassy, the Military Museum seemed the most appropriate choice. Since first visiting the German military cemetery at Langemark in Belgium, I could not get the image of a mass grave of bodies piled on top of each other, the Kameradengrab, or comrade's grave, out of my head. The mass grave stelae at Langemark and their front surfaces containing the names of so many would not only inform the conceptual underpinning of Stela, but also its aesthetic design. I sent a proposal to the Military History Museum, and after visiting Dresden to discuss the project with Research Director Dr. Gorsch Pekin, curator of the temporary exhibition about the First World War, Dr. Gerhard Bauer, and Katja Prota, head of the Department of Fine Art, I received an email from Dr. Pekin. Dear Kingsley Baird, it was a pleasure to have you as our visitor. As you correctly stated in your letter, April the 12th, We are enthusiastic about exhibiting and realizing the Stela project. Location and timing is perfect. It will coincide with our big 100th anniversary exhibition about World War I in August 2014. Of course, there will be some challenges, and I'm sure we will overcome them together. The Stela project is in perfect alignment with our museum's philosophy, to give our visitors real food for thought. Best regards, Gorsh Pekin. During the course of over 2 years, I visited the museum again and exchanged numerous emails with Dr. Pekin as we devised how Stela would be realized, including where it would be located, who would make the two primary components, the stainless steel cenotaph, and the thousands of biscuits which would be stacked around it. While the basic proof of concept had been established in my temporary installation tomb at Francis Historial de la Grande Guerre a year earlier, there were still many matters to be resolved, not least securing sufficient funds to achieve the project. While Dr. Pekin's email predicts challenges ahead, and there certainly were, he also expressed his confidence that they would be overcome together. To be embedded in the Military History Museum meant to engage with the culture or ethos of the institution, its architecture, the staff with whom I worked, its visitors, and the artifacts it displays. However, fundamental to the experience were my connections to parts of Dresden and the city's history. These, along with my own background, including visiting sites such as Langemark, affected my experience and the manner in which I engaged with this military institution, and therefore what it meant to be embedded from my perspective. Prior to visiting Dresden, my knowledge of the city and its rich and remarkable history was rudimentary. Baroque architecture, Meissen porcelain, and Slaughterhouse 5. Both Kurt Vonnegut's 1969 semi-autographical novel and George Roy Hill's 1972 film. I was also aware of the long-standing tensions concerning conflict and coexistent perceptions of victim and perpetrator relating to the horrendous events in the city in the final months of National Socialism, the historic schism between the Communist East and Democratic West, and the influence of the political far right. While I avoided conversations about these topics when in Dresden, mostly because they were not initiated by locals, I believe I felt their uneasy and unresolved presence hanging in the air of that beautiful city of art and culture. Upon my arrival in Dresden, the complexity of the city's multidimensional history began to reveal itself in its streets and landmarks. As is my habit, probably due to a poor sense of direction or an unadventurous spirit, I quickly developed a rat's runway that led from my Best Western hotel on Buchenstrasse to the Military History Museum. Left into Rudolf Leonhard Strasse, if Rudolf Leonhard was the author and communist activist, I guess the street was named after the Nazi defeat, and then right along Stauffenberger Allee. Of course, the Count was a key Weimar figure in the German resistance to Nazism, but subsequent research revealed a much more nuanced character than that portrayed by Tom Cruise in Valkyrie. From Stauffenberger Allee, left again into Albrechtplatz and past the Soviet War Memorial, inaugurated in 1945. The inscription reads, "Eternal glory to the fighters of the Red Army, who fell in the battles against the German fascist invaders for the freedom and independence of the Soviet homeland." The monument was shifted from its old location on Albertplatz in 1994 And this is where I'm indebted to Nisha for some background information here. You observe that very broadly speaking, Soviet memorials in Central Europe have become marginalized, though more often through disregard and loss of symbolic status than through physical removal. It seems this memorial has experienced all three of these forms of marginalization, though its relatively obscure new home is closer to the Soviet garrison cemetery located on Marianali in the district of Albertstadt. On reaching my destination, I headed straight to the museum shop and purchased Frederick Taylor's Dresden, Tuesday, February 13th, 1945. 80 years tomorrow is the anniversary of the beginning of the 13th to the 15th February 1945 bombing of Dresden by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. The Military History Museum's building's original purpose was that of an arsenal for the Royal Saxon Army, commissioned by Kaiser Wilhelm I to commemorate the 1871 Prussian triumph in the Franco-Prussian War. Since its erection between 1873 and 1877, the building's use as an arsenal, a museum, and even a municipal hall has reflected the wider political, ideological, and military history of the nation and the state of Saxony. In its present form, the German Armed Forces Museum of Military History in Dresden reopened in 2011. The New Zealand flag that's flying is not for me, but for the New Zealand ambassador who visited at the time. I'd like to claim that, but I have to come clean. In the museum's exhibition guide, edited by former director Colonel Matthias Grog and Gorsh Pekin, the institution's ambitious and, in my view, highly laudable goals are outlined, including the Museum B, a forum for critical, differentiated, and honest debate about the military, war, and violence in the past and present, end quote. The aptly named exciting architecture in the exhibition guide comprises an extension designed by Daniel Liebesgang and described by his studio as, quote, a 5-story, 14,500 ton wedge of glass, concrete, and steel. It is, states the exhibition guide, quote, the largest and therefore the most important object in the museum, end quote, and according to its designer, intended to create a bold interruption, a fundamental dislocation, to penetrate the arsenal and create a new experience. The interior's classical spatial structure has been eradicated, according to the guide. There are no right angles. Recesses and new visual axes encourage shift of position, changes of perspective, and quite literally new ways of seeing, according to the guide. Once again, according to the guide, the line of sight in the tip of the wedge is exactly directed to the point in Dresden's Friedrichstadt district, where the first British aircraft dropped their light markings, which guided the following bomber formations during that terrible nighttime raid bombing in 1945. Unlike the museum and the Albertstadt district, where it is located and remained relatively unscathed during the bombing, the inner city was largely destroyed. While other buildings reconstructed after World War II, such as the Zwinger, Semperoper, and Dresden Castle, are very impressive, I was intrigued, and probably many other witnesses before and after me have been, by the Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, and the realization that the dark sandstone blocks forming an irregular patchwork on the building's exterior were salvaged from the pre-1945 bombing. The burnt stones are witnesses to the firebombing and an aid memoir to those who might need it, a jolt from picturesque beauty to dark tourism. It's estimated that between 22,700 and 25,000 people were killed, many burnt to death in the resulting firestorm. Gruesome photos show Dresden's dead piled in preparation for cremation, a task undertaken by the SS because of their expertise in cremating the bodies of concentration camp victims. The sight of baked soldier-shaped biscuits lying on a tray in an oven would never mean the same again. While perhaps an association for those familiar with the horrors of February 1945, when coming across this fountain and its beautiful reconstructed setting, I couldn't get Frederick Taylor's description out of my mind. Many died trying to take refuge in the water of the fountain in the middle of the square. The water boiled dry. In my imagination, I carried Taylor's words everywhere. It was as if, like Billy Pilgrim's world, I was unstuck in time, seeing black and white images from the past overlaid on the present. I was also reminded of two other cities in which I had worked, destroyed in war and rebuilt. In Ypres, in Belgium, I was an artist in residence at the Flanders Fields Museum, reconstructed after the First World War. And Nagasaki, destroyed when an atomic bomb was dropped on the 9th of August, 1945. In the city's Peace Park is a sculpture I designed. In this presentation, I've proposed an expanded definition of what it means to be an artist embedded in a military institution based on personal experience. While a potential imbalance in power relations between artist and military institution must be acknowledged, the artist being physically in the military space, apparently governed by its rules and protocols, there is also a potential reputational risk that the artist will not comply with the expectations of the institution, for example, in terms of behavior and the expected standard of the artwork. For the purposes of this presentation, I reread the significant number of emails exchanged between myself and Gorsh Pekin. It is clear that establishing terms of engagement on an interpersonal level was essential for the success of the SPEAR project. Over a 2-year period, the two of us worked through funding and technical challenges, as well as identifying the key partners in making the stainless steel inner form cenotaph and baking the Anzac recipe soldier-shaped biscuits. Both the engineers in the Baking Academy who produced cenotaph and the biscuits, respectively, were exemplary partners. A successful engagement between artist and military institution relies on establishing these strong interpersonal relationships founded on trust. My experience with working with Dr. Pekin and his colleagues was characterized by their professionalism, enablement, sympathy, mutual respect, and trust, and a commitment to realizing the project to the artist's vision. In my engagement with the Military History Museum, I always felt there was something greater than the institution and the artist's project. Perhaps in Gorsh Pekin's words, our role was to, quote, provide food for thought for visitors to the museum. And the high level of external interest in the project, important both to artist and institution, apparently met the museum's expectations. There was significant engagement from its public audience and a high level of attention from print, radio, and TV media, locally, nationally, and even internationally. The Stela installation represented an expanded experience of being embedded, one in which I drew on many related experiences from a wide variety of references, including my past, sites of memory, and historical and cultural factors. In returning to the use of symbiotic in the title of the paper, the conditions in which an artist is embedded in a military institution, in my experience, can be mutually beneficial. According to Gorsh-Pekin, quote, works by modern artists form another central theme in the new building and to permit a different approach to aspects of military history or the history of violence. Perhaps as a measure of the success of the relationship between the Military History Museum or the Bundeswehr, German Armed Forces, and myself is that the engagement did not end with the Stieler exhibition. Rather, we participated in each other's conferences and publication, and I continue to be in contact with museum staff who are incredibly generous and obliging considering my requests, including providing information about photos of artifacts in their collection. My most recent communication concerned gathering information for this conference lecture. These ongoing professional and academic connections could be seen as continuing the embedded engagement, one based on a symbiotic relationship. Exhibiting Stieler at the Military History Museum confirmed that to be embedded in that case is much more than a specific engagement circumscribed by time and space, one limited to the confines of the institution and the duration of the project. Rather, it also includes myriad external factors to that experience, involving the crucial role of memory, in which the recall of sensations, events, and individuals is prompted by subsequent incidents. About a year following the exhibition of Stieler at the Military History Museum in Dresden, I returned to the museum. As I entered, I was greeted by a staff member who recognized me from the year before. Immediately, and with considerable excitement, he informed me that the aroma of Stieler's biscuits could be perceived by him and his colleagues long after the exhibition was gone. It was satisfying to imagine the smell lingered in their imaginations and possibly the fabric of the building, and the sensual memory of Stieler as witness to the work transcended its actual presence. If such recollections remained for those in the museum, what I describe as embedded experiences at the Military History Museum persist in my memory, as these two examples illustrate. The military presence in the Museum of the Bundeswehr was apparent without being overwhelming. Museum military staff would occasionally walk by undertaking their duties, or visiting armed services personnel would be part of guided tours. A member of the military staff was assigned to the Stieler project in a particular capacity, which meant that our paths crossed frequently. One Friday, when driving to a project-related engagement, we talked about his plans for the weekend. His girlfriend had a young son, and every weekend he drove to his hometown to be with them. I already knew something of the city when reading my Concise History of Germany book during visits to the Laundrette and Rudolf Leonardstrasse, and registered its tragic history at the time. 3 major devastations, including the medieval fire, sacking during the 30 Years' War, and the destruction from Allied bombing. On the 20th of December last year, I was transported back to 2014 and the conversation with the soldier when I heard the shocking news of the attack on Magdeburg Christmas market, in which 5 people were killed and some 200 others injured. I hoped he and his family were well. They were very excited at the museum, especially the military. The Minister of Defence was coming to visit. I was requested to meet the Armed Forces boss. Wikipedia: born in Belgium, 7 children, a member of the centre-right Christian Democratic Union. I stood obediently at my post until the flurry of activity at the adjacent gallery indicated the minister had arrived. And then she appeared, petite with a shock of brushed back blonde hair, flanked by men in military and civilian uniforms. Today, she was wearing trousers. What should I wear? I asked Dr. Pekin when I heard of the VIP's visit. You can wear anything, he replied. You are the artist. She smiled broadly and, exuding a charm that immediately put me at ease, commented, I've read about you. And I about you, I replied thoughtlessly, regretting it immediately and sensing her minder's disapproval at the artist's impudence and concerned their plans for a successful visit might be ruined. Ein Künstler und ein Ausländer, unknown terrain. May I come in? She gestured to the stanchions surrounding the stela. Once inside the perimeter, she asked what the work was about, and I responded with a version appropriate for a busy minister on a military schedule. May I try one? She asked a little coyly. I'd not expected this. No one had. The press were there en masse, an unflattering snap. Few of us looked good, frozen while eating. An injudicious moment. But it was the symbolism of the Minister of Defence biting the head off an albeit emblematic soldier that I thought a savvy politician might avoid. It was the kind of image that could come back to haunt one, especially if, as Wikipedia commented at the time, she was a contender to succeed the Chancellor. And politicians have an instinct for such things. But the minister wasn't listening. She bit off the head of a New Zealander, declared him delicious, and requested the recipe claimed by Australia and New Zealand. Again, with consummate charm, she requested my signature on one of the photographic giveaway cards depicting biscuits and cookie cutter. I obliged. There was a blur of photos. She thanked me and was gone, her diminutive figure lost in a sea of followers. A good sport, I thought. Every time Ursula von der Leyen appears in the news in her capacity as the President of the European Commission, including last night on the BBC, The World Today, speaking at the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit in Paris, I am reminded of my meeting with her and the Stela project at the Military History Museum in 2014. Vielen Dank, ngā mihi nui, many thanks.
Very much, Kingsley. It was really interesting, a fascinating tour de force, tour of your work with the military, with different militaries, different military institutions, and of course a wonderful anecdote. Please take a seat. All right, the floor is open. We have about 26 minutes until the food arrives. So depending on how hungry you are, we have maybe about half an hour. Nigina.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I absolutely love the Stella project. I'm interested, what was the perception of the visitors, right? Could they share your vision of the project, or were they just enjoying the cookies?
Yeah, so I think all of those things. So some people were really interested in eating them and ate them on the spot in the museum. Some people saw them as souvenirs. They were given a grease-proof bag that had, you know, the museum's insignia and other information about the project, and they took them away. I don't know what they did with them afterwards. Like all institutions, they have visitors who are just cruising through, and others who are intensely interested in what they're seeing and what they're doing. There were 18,000 biscuits when the work was completed, and by the end of the exhibition, which was about a week later or something like that, probably about 4/5 or something like that, had been consumed one way or another. So some people were intensely interested. There was a language barrier because I don't speak German. And I think in Dresden, maybe a lot of the visitors, not many people spoke English. But I did have some fantastic conversations and really moving conversations with some people. One that I'll never forget was an elderly couple who turned up and sort of hovered around the work for a while. And then the man walked off and looked at some other exhibits. And the elderly woman just stood there, not saying anything. And so I approached her, and I'd memorized this terrible bit of German in which I briefly described what the project was about. And she just looked at me, not, you idiot, what are you saying? But there was a connection there, and for some reason we both started crying. And I think it was because she might have had a relative who was in the Second World War, maybe the First World War, I'm not sure. But it was a moving experience for both of us. So there was a whole range of different kinds of emotional experiences. Sometimes when the military visited, that was also quite interesting. Some sailors came from Kiel. Yeah, and they were very, very interested. They just stood there for a long time, kind of thinking about it. Others just cruised by, didn't even look at it, probably weren't even aware it was there. So, as I say, a whole range of responses.
Jessica, and then
Yeah, following Regina's question, I'm also very interested in the Stella project, which is amazing. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether you consulted the potential audience before launching this project. And generally, what particular fields of researchers do you usually consult while designing, while producing your art? Yeah, so I'm interested in that. What general other discourses influence your creativity? Generally, I know that you consult military institutions and museum administrations and your network, but particularly what fields are these people from, usually, yeah? And I have a second question maybe after this answer I will ask.
So I had experimented with using biscuits before. It's important to understand that Anzac biscuits are really important in New Zealand and Australia because they are symbols of particularly the First World War, but also the Second World War to a certain extent. Both countries are very competitive. One's quite a bit larger than the other, of course, but they both claim this Anzac biscuit recipe. And if you get an opportunity to try real Anzac biscuits, they are delicious. So I had experimented with this in an exhibition in New Zealand, but in a very modest way. So the incorporation of biscuits was very limited in the scope of the exhibition, and also they were only New Zealand soldiers. And you could tell which the nationality was by the profiles of the different soldiers. And then again, I explored the idea at the Historial de la Grande Guerre in France with the Tomb project. The whole project was about memory. So it was based on Edmund Lutyens' Stone of Remembrance, which is in all of the, or most of the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries. And the words, their name, live forevermore. And by making an ephemeral, it was a one-to-one exact copy of Lutyens' stone tomb. By making it out of ephemeral materials, I wanted to question that notion of memory lasting forever. They weren't edible biscuits. You could eat them. I ate one. They were basically flour and water because there wasn't sufficient budget to realize the project in the way that I had hoped to.
Thanks. Yeah, ask a second question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just I also liked your memory from Dresden, yeah, or which city, yeah, when the Second World War Soviet War monument was removed, yeah, and was marginalized. This reminded me of recent book by Professor Gabovich, who wrote about monuments in Ukraine, which also suffered from this, changing, destroying, marginalizing, if I may say. So I wonder if you have ever suffered, maybe I missed this from your biography, you have ever suffered from these political actions, I would say, these practices in relation to your art, maybe indirect or kind of intention to do that.
Not yet. I have had work. I have had work vandalized, but it was deconstructed by the new owners of the building and
Was it
removed.
political?
No, not at all. It was commercial. But we have similar issues in our country where there are generals and politicians who were responsible for really negative actions against the Indigenous Maori people who are standing there on plinths in marble statues, have streets named after them, even a large city. So this is it's a controversial issue, and what to do with those kinds of memorials, which is what they are, is often quite fraught. Most of the time, I would say keep them and stick a plaque beside them which contextualizes the history. Once you take them away, the history is lost, and the next generation won't have any clue. So they can stand there as a permanent marker for history and memory. But some people's actions were so horrendous that sometimes you don't necessarily want a reminder, and you've got to think about other ways of doing that. Sorry, maybe we could catch up and I'll tell you a story about the city which is named after a soldier in the colonial wars between Maori and British troops. It's a very interesting story, but it's quite a long one, so perhaps we don't have time.
Let's take a few more questions and then maybe we will have time.
Sure, yeah.
So I have Mehil, Linda, and then me.
Okay, so thank you so much. This was so interesting, and I love that you're an artist, right? And that you framed this around creativity and work with military institutions. And I have two questions I'd just like you to expand and kind of comment on. So the first is that it strikes me that you've worked with very specific militaries, and you've been very lucky in that way that these are militaries open to criticism, right? And you sort of said that the definition of success was critical thinking about loss of life, right? Sort of what war is, what war does. That in a way is sort of like with the different hats at Gallipoli, it's both sides, right? It's not about sort of this is commemorating victory of one side over the other. It's about the loss of life, right?
Yeah.
In general. And it seems to me very special that the military institutions that you've worked with have been open to that, right? I can imagine other militaries where they would not be open to that, right? So I wondered if you could sort of comment on that. And then related is that there also seems to be a time issue, right? That this work called World War I, it's a long time ago, right? And so maybe there can be that ability to have that kind of that critical thinking, whereas World War II in many places is still kind of fresh, actually, right? And it's sort of interesting that you had this Stela, which is sort of about World War I, but in Germany it sounds like some of the reception was about World War II as well. And so I'm wondering if there's a time issue, right? Does it matter for an artist if you're creating a piece that is about something 100 years ago versus creating a piece that might be more political about now or about something more recent?
Yeah, or I think it can be a combination of both. At the moment, I'm working on a project which is about the impact of the wars of colonization against Maori. And so they were primarily in the 1860s, but really from about 1843 to about 1878. And I'm doing a project which is about history, because, and most of you will find this absolutely shocking, but in New Zealand, until about a year ago, there was not a compulsory history program. So you only elected to do history if you were interested in doing history. So a lot of New Zealanders, particularly Pākehā or Europeans or descendants of European settlers, don't necessarily know the history of the country, which of course is problematic. So I'm working on that project, which will be a sculpture project, and it's about play. And so I'm making games that anyone can play, but particularly children, as a means to learn about their history. But I think you're so right in terms of anniversaries. Of course, museums are interested in getting people in the door, right? That's how they are going to survive. It was really interesting, Peter talking earlier about in Flanders Fields Museum. All museums, particularly if they're related to the First World War, have challenges, right? Because it's a conflict which is receding into the past and quite quickly. I have been working on a project which deals with conflict from antiquity to the present day, but is kind of misinterpreted as being related to the First World War. And one museum said, we really like the work, but we can't show it because of the connection to the First World War, which everyone's had enough of, the fatigue of commemoration.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Linda.
you. I'm curious about your experience of working with military institutions in Europe and in New Zealand, and how similar, how different are your collaborations or challenges? And then perhaps a follow-up to this issue of indigenous perspective, that how much has that impacted how the world wars are commemorated in New Zealand? I mean, obviously there are lots of discussions, developments going on around colonial history and rethinking it, decolonizing it, but how much has this indigenous rights movement and the rather prominent indigenous contemporary artists in New Zealand or in Australia, how much have they been engaged in commemoration of the wars of the 20th century? Maybe
I'll answer or try to answer the second question, because first, and then the first one. Māori were well represented in the New Zealand Army in both the First and the Second World War. A lot of that is tied to citizenship. There's a museum in the north of the North Island, which is called something translated as the price of citizenship. Because of the impact of the colonial wars in the 19th century, most Māori lost most of their land, which was confiscated, appropriated, stolen, or bought. And Māori didn't feel that they were citizens in their own land. And so a lot signed up to fight in the First World War and in the Second World War. Interestingly, they mostly came from tribes who were allied to the British government. Those who had suffered really badly from having their land confiscated weren't going to fight for the government for obvious reasons. That changed a little bit in the Second World War. Recent commemorative events and the approach of the New Zealand Defence Force has been really welcoming of Māori soldiers, airmen, and air personnel, and also Navy personnel. There is a strong, and this sounds like a cliche, but it's not a cliche, because you could say exactly the same about almost every people, including British in New Zealand. They are a martial society. being a warrior is a very respected position. And so going to war was a sign of citizenship, if you like, paying a price for citizenship. But also it was something that, like lots of young men at that time were interested in doing. Sorry, does that answer some of your question? Maybe we can talk later more about it. The other question about the military institutions, they're very different. I found the civilian curators and military historians at the Military History Museum in Dresden. Quite a few of them actually come from a military background. I don't know if it's still the case, the young people have to do military service, but for some of them that was the case. So they have a military background to a certain extent. They were really thoughtful, intellectual, passionate about what they were doing, without saying too much, because they are also embedded in military institutions. There were times on the Stela project, I know this, where things got a little bit difficult, and they fought for the project. There isn't that kind of intellectual commitment in the New Zealand Defence Forces. There are lots of very good military historians, but they tend to be civilians. Sometimes former, particularly army officers, when they retire, they take up military history. But there isn't, I don't think there's the same depth of criticality, or at least there is, but not perhaps in the numbers that you might find in Germany.
Thank you. We actually have a question on Zoom from Lourdes Hurtado, who is going to speak to us on Zoom during the conference. Lourdes, can you turn on your camera as well, please?
Okay, just give me a minute.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. I am in Indiana. So I am originally from Peru, but I am right now in Indiana. So I wanted to ask a question regarding the global war on terror, and if some of the memorializing efforts have, with regard to the New Zealand military, have also been paying attention to the last events in the last 25, 24 years. I was curious about this.
New Zealand's a very remote place, not just geographically, but because it's remote geographically, it's also removed from a lot of those kinds of events that other countries are blighted with. You're probably aware that there was a so-called terrorist attack in the city of Christchurch some years ago. It's just not really part of people's frame of reference. There is a memorial or there are a number of memorials, and I think the local Muslim community is working on a significant memorial that relates to their mosques. More than that, I don't know. Sorry, that probably, do you want to just expand that question? I don't think I really fully grasped.
No, I think you have answered it. I was just curious since I think New Zealand forces were part of the coalition that supported the invasion of Iraq in 2001. So there were, like, for example, the Spaniards were also actively involved in the early years of the invasion in 2003, of Iraq. So I was just curious if there had been any efforts to memorialize part of those experiences.
Actually, I don't think New Zealand was involved in the Iraq war. It's been involved in Afghanistan, but I don't think it was in Iraq. The Prime Minister at the time, Helen Clark, just said, no, we're not going to get involved in that. There's a lot of pressure on a small country like New Zealand to participate. It's not about numbers. It's not about numbers of troops. It's about numbers of countries that those forming the coalition can claim are supporting their efforts. But I don't think New Zealand was involved in the Iraq War.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I actually put myself on the list next, and I want to ask two interrelated questions, continuing Mehl's earlier ones. So you talked about working with military museums, and particularly one military museum in Germany, which, as Mehl suggested, is a very specific kind of military museum attached to a very specific, very unusual kind of military.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering, trying to tie this to the theme of our conference, what was actually special about working with a museum that is technically part of a military compared with a civilian museum? Because, I mean, even though you told us that a lot of the staff and the directors, etc., have a military background, it seems to me, and I have visited that museum, that it's very different from the kinds of military museums that started emerging in the 19th century. You know, the Austrian Military Museum, where the previous conference in this series took place. So that, there is kind of a sort of organizational convergence, perhaps. So I'm wondering whether you could tell us whether there's something that's really specific about working with that kind of military institution, which is a museum. And then I'll ask my second question next. Or maybe let me just add one thing. How would your work, your artistic work, and specifically your work on commemoration and memorialization be different in an entirely non-military context? So is there anything that makes working with military institutions special in terms of how you interact with them?
Once again, I think it depends entirely on the institution. So there's a great deal of variety from what I can understand between different military institutions. So I've exhibited twice at the National Army Museum in New Zealand. And on both occasions, I turned up with the work after having a very brief conversation with the curator, set up the exhibition, and within 24 hours was gone. So there was no suggestion of being embedded because there wasn't a chance to be embedded. I think it's the degree of intellectual engagement that's offered by a place like the Military History Museum. But I would say that, as I mentioned before, because the people who work in that museum are already embedded in the military, whether they're civilians or not. And so there's a pressure there to conform to the military culture in some respects. I imagine that there is a pressure to do things which are not controversial. And yeah, I think it's just that criticality, and I think that criticality probably comes from Germany's history to a large extent. Also, I'm sorry, there's some things I don't really want to mention because they might compromise other people, but I would say that it would be difficult, it would be challenging at times, but I think that probably working in all museums are like that in terms of, are we going to get the numbers through the door? Are the punters going to like this particular exhibition, and so on? Is it too controversial that we can't show it and there's going to be an outcry because of such and such? So they suffer those same kinds of things. But they've had, I think, the Guerrilla Girls exhibited there some years ago. So I think that they're open to all kinds of sort of voices. It's a matter of persuading their bosses, probably, that it's a good idea.
So one might say that it just adds an additional layer of organizational complexity and constraint rather than turning it into a very different kind of institution from other museums.
Yeah.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, I find constraints quite challenging, frankly. I quite enjoy them. So those constraints I was aware of, but I didn't have to deal with them. I knew that people had my back in terms of wanting to see the project through. And in the end, the military was obviously happy with it.
Thank you. So my next question is connected to what you said about being embedded, and I really liked the way in which you added a lot of nuance to this term of being embedded and your reflections about the implications of being embedded as an artist or as a journalist. At the previous workshop, we had a keynote talk by an American war photographer, Ben Brody, who was actually embedded as a photographer with the American Army in Afghanistan and Iraq. And he distinguished, and I'm going to return to that in my introduction tomorrow morning, he distinguished between being embedded, being attached, and being assigned to an army unit.
Yeah.
The main difference being that when you're embedded, you're not actually a member of the army.
Yeah.
You're just drawing on its resources because you need to be where only the army can take you.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're either attached or assigned to a military unit, that means that organizationally you are part of the army.
Right.
Now, a lot of the artists that I think we are going to discuss at this conference were actually not just embedded, they were assigned in the sense that they were members of the military.
Yeah.
Now, in your artistic practice, have you interacted with such artists who, unlike yourself, were really part of a military apparatus? And if so, have you noticed any difference in approach to art? Is the art that artists in uniform produce different in any significant way from the art that you produce, that you create?
Yes, until very recently, we had the equivalent of an official war artist. But for some reason, that scheme has now ended. But I knew the last one, and he did what quite a few war artists do, and that is he produced representational works that showed soldiers undertaking their duties, whether it was in combat zones or during peacetime, the kind of work that you could have taken a photograph and achieved the same outcome. In fact, I think he took photos and painted photos. And that was the expectation of the military, which I think are inherently conservative in many respects. And that could be because of their personalities, or it could be because that's what their expectations of what war art should be about, which is so much of a contradiction in terms of, while I was writing this, I was thinking quite a lot about official war artists, particularly in Britain, who were actually really quite innovative, who were war artists in the First World War, but even looking at German and Austrian artists who were in similar capacities in relation to their armed forces, a lot of the time, they weren't just complying with what the army was obviously expecting of them.
Thank you. I had Ines?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how you were constantly self-reflecting on your relationships with the institutions you were working with. And it kind of begged the question for me, if you have ever articulated to yourself the terms under which you would work for an institution. What is your condition for being embedded in a military context like that? And related to that would be the question whether you've ever turned down a commission for ethical reasons.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
So I always do what I want to do, whether it's in relation to a military museum or whatever. And if people aren't interested, then they're not interested. I just do what I do. So there's no thought of, oh, could you do this, or could you add that, or could you tone that down a little bit? I have no interest in that whatsoever. So, sorry, does that answer your question or?
I guess I was more interested to hear what your, if you have articulated for yourself, which you could share with us, the conditions under which you're prepared to work for example, military, and maybe there's a red line where you wouldn't take a commission. Of course, obviously, you don't want to be defined in your work or compromised in your work. That is obvious. But also, if the commission is too straightforwardly propagandistic, for example, do you have articulated any terms for when you work for an institution?
No, the issue has never arisen. I presume that at a discussion or proposal stage, that it becomes clear to both parties that something is not going to work. If I was going to do something that was considered sort of propaganda, I'd do a project that undermined that intention, but I'd make it really clear that that's what I was going to do. I think it's perfectly reasonable if someone wants to do something that in some subtle way questions or undermines, and in a country that's not a democracy, that's probably how artists operate all the time, unless they want to end up in jail. But I'm always really straightforward about what my intentions are, what the work means. The three pieces that were used by the New Zealand Defence Force in their Gallipoli commemoration have some quite heavy meanings to them in terms of the use of mythology by nations, particularly nations like New Zealand and Australia, as a means to promote militaristic activities. And the Australian one was also about the Australian government's attitude to boat people and confining them to offshore islands. So that's probably not going to be shown at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, I would guess, but no, I don't care about that. I mean, it would be great to have that opportunity, but if I was to have that opportunity, I'd tell them what the work was about. Then it's on them to take that on or not, as the case may be.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering that besides the institutional embedding, there must be a form of being embedded in the form, that how much in the keynote, how much the 100 years tradition of visual language of the First World War limits your creativity or makes you feel constrained by in your own expression. So how much the form embeds you?
How much am I constrained by the visual language that already exists around the First World War? I think there would always be references. So that cenotaph, for example, was a reference to, cenotaphs, and particularly the famous one in Whitehall in London. But also it was a kind of a joke too. So it could be seen as a cenotaph, which had bodies stacked in it. It was the size of a coffin. But also it was a biscuit tin. So it had a lid that fitted, that had a rim around it that could come on and off. So that was a reference to the Anzac biscuits. But also it was important to have some humour in there in terms of the solemn nature in which we commemorate events.
Okay, I've got a related question, because you very humbly said what your inspirations were. in the Stella project. But I'm just wondering, do you know of any other artists who picked things up from you? Because it seems to me that, for example, this idea of soldiers as perishable goods, this was perhaps recurring later in many projects commemorating the First World War, and your project predated them. Do you know of any artists who did that?
No, I don't.
Because in Birmingham, there were those ice figurines melting, 50,000 ice figurines. So it brought those ideas to me that there might have been.
I think using ephemeral materials to talk about memory and the longevity or briefness of memory, particularly around commemoration, is quite a common trope with many artists who work in that space. But no, I don't know of anyone who's been making biscuits.
Any other works?
No.
If people, is it a hand?
I just had one question. If we could go back to the discussion you initiated about embeddedness, which I found really interesting. I'm just wondering, what would you define as the limits of embeddedness? So who, as an artist, is not embedded in the military? Do you only see it as like monetary benefit of sorts or some kind of financial gains, or how do you, I'm just wondering how you define that.
Do you mean in terms of myself or anyone
Exactly,
who's embedded in that? Well, I don't like the art scene because to succeed in the art scene, lots of artists have to embed themselves in the art scene, which means sometimes ingratiating themselves with museums and galleries and sponsors and patrons and the like. So I guess anyone who's concerned with commercial imperatives is going to be under threat of the possibility of being embedded one way or another. So I guess there's the potential for all of us to be embedded in some way or other. And a way of resisting that is trying to maintain one's integrity as much as possible. So turning down opportunities that might compromise that, I think, is really important. However, I work in an academic situation, I get a salary, so it's all very well for me to make comments like that. However, before I became an academic, I was a practicing artist who just made what I wanted to make. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I mean, it opens up a lot of new ideas for me. So I'm smiling because I'm thinking about a lot of things. But yeah, it's cool.
We have another 2.5 days to talk about it. I have to admit, I'm torn between my suspicion that everybody is getting hungry and my desire to hear the anecdote that you said would be too long. How many minutes do you think it would take for you to tell us?
Sorry, can you just remind me what the anecdote was? What was it in relation to?
About Maori? Is it about my question?
Oh, sorry, yes, that's right. So there is a city in the north of the North Island called Hamilton. And Hamilton is named after Captain Hamilton, who was a naval officer during the wars fought between the British forces and Maori who resisted their lands being taken. Now, Hamilton lies right in the center of one of the examples of the most gross injustices in terms of land confiscations in the history of the country. Through judicial processes and acts of parliament, many tribes have got their lands back, or some of their lands back. There's no way that the compensation that they have received in any way equates to what they originally had, nor does it compensate for the fact that they've lost income over, 100 or 150 years. But now the city is surrounded by one of the wealthiest tribes in the country. And to be the tribes in that area, to have a city that is named after a soldier who fought on the other side, if you like, and not individually, but as a representative was responsible for the confiscation of all of those lands and resources, is really like, thumbing your nose at this tribe. So there's an alternative Māori name for the city, which is used semi-officially sometimes, like when the weather presenter is telling the viewers what the weather's going to be, they will often use Kirikiriroa Hamilton. So they use a sort of a dual name. And, recently there was a statue put up to this guy, Hamilton, by a very wealthy local businessman, who also is a strong opponent of the values of the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty signed between the British representatives, government representatives, and Maori tribes. And this guy, the businessman, was opposed to that and therefore funded the statue. And several years ago, after being daubed with paint and other kind of protests against the body of the statue, the local council decided to remove it. And so that is an example of both a growing awareness amongst the non-Maori population of the history of the land, but also the strength of commercial imperatives when you've got a very wealthy tribe who lives in the same space and provides work opportunities, investment opportunities for the local community, and also the Maori king, who is a invention, if you like, from the mid-19th century, is a member of one of those main tribes. Yeah, it's fascinating. I find it fascinating.
Thank you very much. I think by now we are all hungry, but Kingsley, thank you very much for this amazing lecture, for your very thoughtful answers to our questions, and most of all for coming all this way from New Zealand to participate in this conference. Thank you. Thank you from Indiana.
Okay, great.
So hopefully there's food waiting for us outside.
Yeah, may I just say that I was really interested in the conference because it made me think differently about what I was doing. And so I think that that's a really successful outcome before the conference started.
Excellent. We will tell the Georg Foster Forum that funding has been productive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, Lourdes, see you tomorrow.